Dr. Muhammad Iqbal, Stray Reflections, 1910. Art is a sacred lie. 2. The discovery. Our soul discovers itself when we come into contact with a great mind. It is not until I had realized the infinitude of Goethe's imagination that I discovered the narrow breadth of my own. 3. Human intellect. Human intellect is nature's attempt at self-criticism. 4. The economics of charity. The charitable man really helps the non-charitable, not the indigent. For what is given to the poor is virtually given away to those who do not give anything to the poor. The non-charitable, therefore, are kept in their state of non-benevolence, and the benevolent man pays for them. This is the economics of charity. 5. The existence of God. My friends often ask me, "Do you believe in the existence of God?" I think I am entitled to know the meaning of the terms used in this question before I answer it. My friends ought to explain to me what they mean by believe and existence and God, especially by the last two if they want an answer to their question. I confess I do not understand these terms, and whenever I cross-examine them, I find that they do not understand them either. 6. A dialogue. Heart. It is absolutely certain that God does exist. Head. But my dear boy, existence is one of my categories, and you have no right to use it. Heart. So much the better, my Aristotle. 7. The satisfaction of vanity. The satisfaction of vanity has an economic value with us. Call me sub-assistant surgeon instead of hospital assistant, and I am quite contented even if you do not increase my salary. 8. Cruel psychology. Excuse me a bit of cruel psychology. You fail in your enterprise, and now you wish to leave your home and try your luck in other climes. It is not because your ambition has received a fresh spur from your failure, but chiefly because you wish to hide your face from those who have witnessed your failure. 9. The power of belief. Belief is a great power. When I see that a proposition of mine is believed by another mind, my own conviction of its truth is thereby immensely increased. 10. The God of Islam. Christianity describes God as love, Islam as power. How shall we decide between the two conceptions? I think the history of mankind and of the universe as a whole must tell us as to which of the two conceptions is truer. I find that God reveals himself in history more as power than love. I do not deny the love of God. I mean that, on the basis of our historical experience, God is better described as power. 11. Hegel's system of philosophy. Hegel's system of philosophy is an epic poem in prose. 12. Yesterday morning at about 4, I saw that glorious visitor of our hemisphere known as Halley's Comet. Once in 75 years, this superb swimmer of infinite space appears on our skies. It is only with the eyes of my grandsons that I shall see it again. The state of my mind was quite unique. I felt as if something indescribably vast had been closed up within the narrow limits of my clay. Yet the thought that I could not see this wanderer again brought home to me the painful fact of my littleness. For the moment, all ambition was killed in me. 13. Forms of government. Let fools fight for the forms of government, says Alexander Pope. I cannot agree with this political philosophy. To my mind, government, whatever its form, is one of the determining forces of a people's character. Loss of political power is equally ruinous to nations' character. Ever since their political fall, the Musulmans of India have undergone a rapid ethical deterioration. Of all the Muslim communities of the world, they are probably the meanest in point of character. I do not mean to deplore our former greatness in this country, for I confess, I am almost a fatalist in regard to the various forces that ultimately decide the destinies of nations. As a political force, we are perhaps no longer required, but we are, I believe, still indispensable to the world as the only testimony to the absolute unity of God. Our value among nations, then, is purely evidential. 14. Poetry and logical truth. It is idle to seek logical truth in poetry. The ideal of imagination is beauty, not truth. Do not then try to show a poet's greatness by quoting passages from his works, which in your opinion embody scientific truth. 15. Personal immortality. Personal immortality is not a state, it is a process. I think the distinction of spirit and body has done a lot of harm. Several religious systems have been based on this erroneous distinction. Man is essentially an energy, a force, or rather a combination of forces which admit of various arrangements. One definite arrangement of these forces is personality. Whether it is a purely chance arrangement does not concern me here. I accept it as a fact among other facts of nature, and try to find out whether this arrangement of forces, so dear to us, can continue as it is. Is it then possible that these forces should continue to work in the same direction as they are working in a living, healthy personality? I think it is. Let human personality be represented by a circle, which is only another way of saying that these forces result in describing a definite circle, which may be obliterated by an upsettle of the arrangement of forces constituting it. How then can we manage to secure the continuance of this circle? Evidently by energizing in a way calculated to assist the constitutive forces in their regular routine of work. You must give up all those modes of activity which have a tendency to dissolve personality, e.g., humility, contentment, slavish obedience, modes of human action which have been erroneously dignified by the name of virtue. On the other hand, high ambition, generosity, charity, and a just pride in our traditions and power fortify the sense of personality. Personality, being the dearest possession of man, must be looked upon as the ultimate good. It must work as a standard to test the worth of our actions. That is good 30, which has a tendency to give us the sense of personality. That is bad, which has a tendency to suppress and ultimately dissolve personality. By adopting a mode of life calculated to strengthen personality, we are really fighting against death. A shock, which may dissolve the arrangement of forces we call personality. Personal immortality then lies in our own hands. It requires an effort to secure the immortality of the person. The idea I have dropped here has far-reaching consequences. I wish I could have time to discuss the comparative value of Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity from the standpoint of this idea, but unfortunately I am too busy to work out the details. 16. History. History is a sort of applied ethics. If ethics is to be an experimental science like other sciences, it must be based on the revelations of human experience. A public declaration of this view will surely shock the susceptibilities even of those who claim to be orthodox in morality, but whose public conduct is determined by the teachings of history. 17. Metaphysics. I confess I am a bit tired of metaphysics, but whenever I happen to argue with people, I find that their arguments are always based on certain propositions which they assume without criticism. I am therefore driven to examine the value of these propositions. The practical in all its shapes drives me back to the speculative. It seems to me to be impossible to get rid of metaphysics altogether. 18. Fanaticism. All nations accuse us of fanaticism. I admit the charge. I go further and say that we are justified in our fanaticism. Translated in the language of biology, fanaticism is nothing but the principle of individuation working in the case of group. In this sense, all forms of life are more or less fanatical and ought to be so if they care for their collective life. And as a matter of fact, all nations are fanatical. Criticize an Englishman's religion, he is immovable, but criticize his civilization, his country, or the behavior of his nation in any sphere of activity, and you will bring out his innate fanaticism. The reason is that his nationality does not depend on religion. It has a geographical basis, his country. His fanaticism then is justly roused when you criticize his country. Our position, however, is fundamentally different. With us, nationality is a pure idea. It has no material basis. Our only rallying point is a sort of mental agreement in a certain view of the world. If then our fanaticism is roused when our religion is criticized, I think we are as much justified in our fanaticism as an Englishman is when his civilization is denounced. The feeling in both cases is the same, though associated with different objects. Fanaticism is patriotism for religion, patriotism, fanaticism for country. 19. Patriotism. Islam appeared as a protest against idolatry. And what is patriotism but a subtle form of idolatry, a deification of a material object? The patriotic songs of various nations will bear me out in my calling. Patriotism, a deification of a material object. Islam could not tolerate idolatry in any form. It is our eternal mission to protest against idolatry in all its forms. What was to be demolished by Islam could not be made the very principle of its structure as a political community. The fact that the Prophet prospered and died in a place not his birthplace is perhaps a mystic hint to the same effect. 20. Justice. Justice is an inestimable treasure, but we must guard it against the thief of mercy. 21. Muslim solidarity. From what I have said above on Islam and patriotism, it follows that our solidarity as a community rests on our hold on the religious principle. The moment this hold is loosened, we are nowhere. Probably the fate of the Jews will befall us, and what can we do in order to tighten the hold? Who is the principal depository of religion in a community? It is the woman. The Muslim woman ought to receive sound religious education, for she is virtually the maker of the community. I do not believe in an absolute system of education. Education, like other things, is determined by the needs of a community. For our purposes, religious education is quite sufficient for the Muslim girl. All subjects which have a tendency to dewomanize and to demuslimize her must be carefully excluded from her education. But our educationists are still groping in the dark. They have not yet been able to prescribe a course of study for our girls. They are perhaps too much dazzled by the glamour of Western ideals to realize the difference between Islamism, which constructs nationality out of a purely abstract idea, i.e. religion, and Westernism, the very lifeblood of whose concept of nationality is a concrete thing, i.e. country. 22. The German nation. In the economy of nature, each nation has a function allotted to it. The function of the German nation is the organization of human knowledge, but they have recently started on a commercial enterprise which may give them an empire, but they will have to suffer the displacement of a higher ideal by the all-absorbing spirit of trade. 23. The modern Hindu. It is extremely interesting to watch the birth and growth of a new ideal among a people. Oh, the enthusiasm it inspires, and the force with which it attracts all the energies of a people to one common center. The modern Hindu is quite a phenomenon. To me, his behavior is more of a psychological than a political study. It seems that the ideal of political freedom, which is an absolutely new experience to him, has seized his entire soul, turning the various streams of his energy from their wonted channels and bringing them to pour forth their whole force into this new channel of activity. When he has passed through this experience, he will realize his loss. He will be transformed into an absolutely new people. New in the sense that he will no longer find himself dominated by the ethical ideals of his ancestors, whose sublime fancies have been a source of perpetual consolation to many a distressed mind. Nations are mothers of ideals, but ideals in course of time become pregnant and give birth to new nations. 24. Right and might. Philosophy is the logic of right. History, the logic of might. The canons of this later logic appear to be more sound than those of her sister logic. 25. The future of Afghanistan. The verdict of history is that buffer states have never been able to form themselves into great political units. So was the case with Syria, a buffer state between the Empire of Rome and that of the Persians. It seems difficult to forecast the future of Afghanistan. 26. Life as criticism of poetry. Matthew Arnold defines poetry as criticism of life. That life is criticism of poetry is equally true. 27. European Christianity. In the sphere of human thought, Muhammad, Buddha, and Kant were probably the greatest revolutionaries. In the sphere of action, Napoleon stands unrivaled. I do not include Christ among the world's revolutionaries, since the movement initiated by him was soon absorbed by pre-Christian paganism. European Christianity seems to me to be nothing more than a feeble translation of ancient paganism in the language of Semitic theology. 28. Christ and Spinoza. The Jewish race has produced only two great men, Christ and Spinoza. The former was God incarnated in the Son, the latter in the universe. Spinoza was only a completion of the greatest teacher of his race. 29. Aristotle. I have the greatest respect for Aristotle, not only because I, living in the 20th century, know him much better than the older generations of my community, but also because of his vast influence on the thought of my people. The tinge, however, of ingratitude revealed in his criticism of Plato's doctrine of ideas withholds me from giving him my fullest admiration. I do not deny the truth contained in his criticism of his master's views, but I detest the spirit in which he chooses to approach them. 30. The madness of Nietzsche. There are strange inconsistencies in the nature of man. If I marry a prostitute, I indicate thereby that I do not object to such nasty alliances. But if you make my conduct the subject of a story, I take it ill. I condemn in theory what I permit in practice. The philosophy of Nietzsche, at least in the domain of ethics, is an attempt rationally to justify the conduct of Europe. Yet this great prophet of aristocracy is universally condemned in Europe. Only a few have realized the meaning of his madness. 31. Aurangzeb. The political genius of Aurangzeb was extremely comprehensive. His one aim of life was, as it were, to subsume the various communities of this country under the notion of one universal empire. But in securing this imperial unity, he erroneously listened to the dictates of his indomitable courage, which had no sufficient background of political experience behind it. Ignoring the factor of time in the political evolution of his contemplated empire, he started an endless struggle, in the hope that he would be able to unify the discordant political units of India in his own lifetime. He failed to Islamize, not in the religious sense, India, just as Alexander had failed to Hellenize Asia. The Englishman, however, came fully equipped with the political experiences of the nations of antiquity, and his patience and tortoise-like perseverance succeeded where the hasty genius of Aurangzeb had failed. Conquest does not necessarily mean unity. Moreover, the history of the preceding Mohammedan dynasties had taught Aurangzeb that the strength of Islam in India did not depend, as his great ancestor Akbar had thought, so much on the goodwill of the people of this land as on the strength of the ruling race. With all his keen political perception, however, he could not undo the doings of his forefathers. Shivaji was not a product of Aurangzeb's reign. The Maharatha owed his existence to social and political forces called into being by the policy of Akbar. Aurangzeb's political perception, though true, was too late. Yet considering the significance of this perception, he must be looked upon as the founder of Musalman nationality in India. I am sure posterity will one day recognize the truth 48 of what I say. Among the English administrators of India, it was Lord Curzon who first perceived the truth about the power of England in India. Hindu nationalism is wrongly attributed to his policy. Time will, I believe, show that it owes its existence to the policy of Lord Ripon. It is therefore clear that in their political purpose and perception both the Mughals and the English agree. I see no reason why the English historian should condemn Aurangzeb, whose imperial ideal his countrymen have followed, and whose political perception they have corroborated. Aurangzeb's political method was certainly very rough, but the ethical worth of his method ought to be judged from the standpoint of the age in which he lived and worked. 32. The conquest of Persia. If you ask me what is the most important event in the history of Islam, I shall say without any hesitation, the conquest of Persia. The Battle of Nehawand gave the Arabs not only a beautiful country, but also an ancient civilization, or more properly a people who could make a new civilization with the Semitic and Aryan material. Our Muslim civilization is a product of the cross-fertilization of the Semitic and the Aryan ideas. It is a child who inherits the softness and refinement of his Aryan mother and the sterling character of his Semitic father. But for the conquest of Persia, the civilization of Islam would have been one-sided. The conquest of Persia gave us what the conquest of Greece gave to the Romans. 33. Ghalib. As far as I can see, Mirza Ghalib, the Persian poet, is probably the only permanent contribution that we, Indian Muslims, have made to the general Muslim literature. Indeed, he is one of those poets whose imagination and intellect place them above the narrow limitations of creed and nationality. His recognition is yet to come. 34. The tutelage of nations. A disinterested foreign rule is an impossibility. Yet the tutelage of nations is a necessity. The fee paid for this tuition is sometimes a nation's daily bread. The Mexicans had to undergo a severe training under the Spaniards before they could undertake to manage their own affairs. 35. The popularity of a poem. The popularity of a poem does not depend on the amount of logical truth revealed in it. Goldsmith's Deserted Village is extremely popular, yet the poem is full of scientific inaccuracies and bad economic reasoning. 36. Hegel, Goethe, Ghalib, Beadle, and Wordsworth. I confess I owe a great deal to Hegel, Goethe, Mirza Ghalib, Mirza Abdul Qadir Beadle, and Wordsworth. The first two led me into the inside of things. The third and fourth taught me how to remain Oriental in spirit and expression after having assimilated foreign ideals of poetry, and the last saved me from atheism in my student days. 37. Parables. To explain the deepest truths of life in the form of homely parables requires extraordinary genius. Shakespeare, Maulana Rum, Jalaluddin, and Jesus Christ are probably the only illustrations of this rare type of genius. 38. The Jewish contribution to civilization. In the development of universal civilization, the Jewish factor cannot be regarded as a negligible quantity. The Jews were probably the first framers of the principles of business morality summed up in the idea of righteousness. 39. Mazzini. The true sphere of Mazzini was literature, not politics. The gain of Italy is not much compared to the loss which the world has suffered by his devotion to politics. 40. The dependence of science on metaphysics. Modern science ought not to mock at metaphysics, for it was a metaphysician, Leibniz, who first gave science her working idea of matter. The substance, said he, is essentially force-resistance. Borrowing this notion from metaphysics, science devotes herself to the study of the behavior of this force, and it is clear that she could not have discovered it for herself. 41. Modern science and democracy. Ideas act and react on each other. The growing spirit of individualism in politics is not without its influence on contemporary scientific thought. Modern thought regards the universe a democracy of living atoms. 42. The relationship of ideas to their historical context. The progress of thought cannot be divorced from other phases of human activity. Our histories of philosophy tell us what various peoples have thought, but they give us no information as to the various causes, social and political, which have determined the character of human thought. To write a complete history of philosophy would certainly be a tremendous task. A mere theologian cannot fully reveal to his readers the rich content of Luther's reform. We are apt to isolate great ideas from the general stream of man's intellectual activity. 43. Polygamy. The institution of polygamy was never meant to be a universal institution. It was permitted to exist in order to meet certain difficulties which are not peculiar to Muslim society alone. The worst of permitted things, according to Islam, is divorce. It was partly to avoid divorce becoming a common social phenomenon that polygamy was tolerated. Of the two social evils, divorce and polygamy, evils if universalized, the later is certainly the lesser. But the avoidance of divorce is perhaps not the only justification for this institution. It is partly a concession to the nature of the male, who, according to this institution, is allowed to indulge in his inclination for variety, without escaping scot-free from the responsibility arising out of this indulgence. In England, the individual does in some cases indulge in such inclinations, but the law leaves him absolutely free from the responsibilities which may arise from his sexual freedom. He is not responsible for the education of the children he produces, nor can such children inherit their father. The consequences in some cases are awful. France has been compelled to recognize prostitution as a social institution, which it is the ugly duty of the state to keep healthy. But perhaps the greatest criticism on monogamy is the existence of the superfluous women in several European countries, where various forces of a social and political nature are tending to enhance the number of women who cannot secure husbands. They cannot become mothers, and consequently they are driven to seek interests other than the bringing up of children. They are compelled to conceive ideas instead of children. Recently, they have conceived the inspiring idea of votes for women. This is really an attempt on the part of the superfluous woman, or if you like, an attempt on her behalf to create interests for her in the sphere of politics. If a society cannot allow their women to produce and bring up children, they must give them something else to be occupied with. The suffragette movement in Europe is at bottom a cry for husbands rather than votes. To me, it is nothing more than a riot of the unemployed. 44. The spiritual ideal of the German nation. It is Goethe's Faust, not the book supposed to have been written by the Galilean fisherman, which reveals the spiritual ideals of the German nation. And the Germans are fully conscious of it. 45. On loving one's enemy, love is more than elixir. The latter is supposed to turn baser metals into gold. The former turns all the baser passions into itself. Christ and Buddha were absolutely correct in their perception of the nature of love. But in their passion for ethical idealism, they ignored the facts of life. It is too much to expect of man to love his enemies. Some extraordinary individuals may have realized this maxim in their life, but as a principle of national morality, the maxim clearly falls down. The results of the Russo-Japanese War would have been different if the Japanese had acted on the principles of morality associated with their religion. 46. Ideas. Individuals and nations die, but their children, i.e. ideas, never die. 47. White man's burden. An English gentleman once told me that he hated the Jews because they believed themselves to be the chosen people of God, a belief which implies and perhaps justifies contempt of other nations. He did not remember that the phrase white man's burden concealed the same Jewish belief in a different garb. 48. Goethe's Faust. Goethe picked up an ordinary legend and filled it with the whole experience of the 19th century, nay, the entire experience of the human race. This transformation of an ordinary legend into a systematic expression of man's ultimate ideal is nothing short of divine workmanship. It is as good as the creation of a beautiful universe out of the chaos of formless matter. 49. Milton. The Puritan theology of Milton cannot appeal to the imagination of our age. Very few people read him. Voltaire is quite true in saying that Milton's popularity will go on increasing because nobody reads him. There is, however, one thing in Milton. No poet has been more serious about his task than him. His style, a gigantic architecture consecrated to false deities, will always stand untouched by the palsied hand of time. 50. The soul of Oscar Wilde. The soul of Oscar Wilde is more Persian than English. 51. Robber nations. The spendthrift is nature's own child. She does not like the accumulation of large masses of wealth in the hands of a few individuals. When the maker of a family succeeds in amassing a fortune, it often happens that in the third or even in the second generation a spendthrift appears and scatters the whole wealth. But for this agent of nature, the circulation of wealth would be clogged. What is true of individuals is also true of nations. When a nation, by industry or otherwise, amasses and hoards up wealth, thus clogging the wheel of the world's industry, the working of which depends on the continual circulation of money, robber nations appear on the scene and set the imprisoned wealth at liberty. Warren Hastings, Clive and Mahmud are the representative types of such nations, which are unconscious agents of nature in the advancement of world's industry. The robbery of Warren Hastings finds its true explanation in the history of the European currencies in the 17th and 18th centuries. 52. The memory of man. The memory of man is generally bad except for the offences he receives from his fellow men. 53. Amusements in Muslim countries. There are no amusements in Muslim countries. No theatres, no music halls, no concerts, and better so. The desire for amusement, once satisfied, soon becomes insatiable. The experience of European countries clearly proves this deplorable fact. The absence of amusement in Muslim countries indicates neither poverty nor austerity nor bluntness of the sense for enjoyment. It reveals that the people of these countries find ample amusement and enjoyment in the quiet circles of their homes. The European critic ought not to be so hasty in his denunciation of the Muslim home. I admit that indifference to outdoor amusement is not a necessary consequence of domestic happiness. Nor does love of amusement necessarily mean domestic unhappiness. 54. The power of minorities. The fate of the world has been principally decided by minorities. The history of Europe bears ample testimony to the truth of this proposition. It seems to me that there is a psychological reason why minorities should have been a powerful factor in the history of mankind. Character is the invisible force which determines the destinies of nations, and an intense character is not possible in a majority. It is a force. The more it is distributed, the weaker it becomes. 55. Skepticism and religion. There are some people who are skeptical and yet of a religious turn of mind. The French Orientalist Renan reveals the essentially religious character of his mind in spite of his skepticism. We must be careful in forming our opinion about the character of men from their habits of thought. 56. Arab poetry. There is my uncle's son walking along the edge of a precipice. Shall I go and from behind push him down the rocky valley to die without a dawn? Considering his treatment, I am perfectly justified in doing so, but it is mean and unmanly to do such a thing. So says the Arab poet in the Hamasa. This passage may be taken as a typical specimen of Arab poetry. No poetry is so direct, so straightforward, and so manly in spirit. The Arab is intensely attached to reality. Brilliancy of color does not attract him. The poet Mutanabi, however, may be regarded as an exception, but he is an Arab poet by language only. In spirit, he is thoroughly Persian. 57. Wonder, says Plato, is the mother of all science. Badil, Mirza Abdul Qadir, looks at the emotion of wonder from a different standpoint. He says, fragilities are contained in the glass house of wonder. Blink not the eye, lest the show might be over. To Plato, wonder is valuable because it leads to our questioning of natura. To Badil, it has a value of its own irrespective of its intellectual consequences. It is impossible to express the idea more beautifully than Badil. 58. The critical period for the Musalmans of India. Insofar as the evolution of religious ideas is concerned, there are principally three stages in the development of a community. 1. The attitude of skepticism towards traditional religion, a revolt against dogma. 2. But the need of religion as a social force of great value is at last felt, and then begins the second stage, an attempt to reconcile religion with reason. 3. This attempt leads necessarily to difference of opinion which may have awful consequences for the very existence of a community. Difference of opinion, if not honest, and unfortunately it is generally not honest, must lead to utter disintegration. The Musalmans of India are now in the third stage, or perhaps partly in the second, partly in the third. This period in the life of our community appears to me to be extremely critical, but I am glad that there are forces of a different nature at work which have a tendency to preserve the solidarity of the community, though their influence, I fear, will be only temporary. 59. The interpretation of history. History is only an interpretation of human motives, and since we are liable to misinterpret the motives of our contemporaries and even of our intimate friends and associates in daily life, it must be far more difficult rightly to interpret the motives of those who lived centuries before us. The record of history, therefore, should be accepted with great caution. 60. Equality. The working power of an idea depends on the force of the personality in which it embodies itself. Muhammad, Buddha, and Jesus Christ are the great embodiments of the ideas of equality. Yet Islam is the only force in the world which is still working in the direction of equality. 61. The worth of things. God created things. Man created the worth of things. The immortality of a people depends upon their incessant creation of worths, said Nietzsche. Things certainly bear the stamp of divine manufacture, but their meaning is through and through human. 62. The end of education. What is the law of things? Continual struggle. What must then be the end of education? Evidently preparation for the struggle. A people working for intellectual superiority reveal thereby their feebleness. 63. God is power. Power is more divine than truth. God is power. Be ye then like your Father who is in heaven. 64. The powerful man. The powerful man creates environment. The feeble have to adjust themselves to it. 65. the touch of power. Power toucheth falsehood, and lo, it is transformed into truth. 666. The thought of the powerful man. Civilization is a thought of the powerful man. 67. Waiting for the Mehdi. Give up waiting for the Mehdi. The personification of power. Go and create him. 68. The idea of nationality. The idea of nationality is certainly a healthy factor in the growth of communities, but it is apt to be exaggerated, and when exaggerated, it has a tendency to kill the broad human elements in art and literature. 69. Kant's categorical imperative. No one can fully understand the significance of Kant's categorical imperative who does not study the political history of the German people. The rigor of Kant's conception of duty finds its full explanation there. 70. To revitalize the dying organism. A diseased social organism sometimes sets up within itself forces which have a tendency to preserve the health of the organism, e.g., the birth of a great personality, which may revitalize the dying organism by the revelation of a new ideal. 71. Self-control. Self-control in individuals builds families. In communities, it builds empires. 72. Idolatry. Both Islam and Christianity had to deal with the same adversary, i.e., idolatry. The difference, however, is this, that Christianity made a compromise with her adversary. Islam destroyed it altogether. 73. The wonderful history of the Muslim community. The more you reflect on the history of the Muslim community, the more wonderful does it appear. From the day of its foundation up to the beginning of the 16th century, about 1,000 years, this energetic race, I say race since Islam has functioned as a race-making force, was continually busy in the all-absorbing occupation of political expansion. Yet in this storm of continuous activity, this wonderful people found sufficient time to unearth and preserve the treasures of ancient sciences, to make material additions to them, to build a literature of a unique character, and above all, to develop a complete system of law, the most valuable legacy that Muslim lawyers have left us. 74. To reconstruct this world. Given character and healthy imagination, it is possible to reconstruct this world of sin and misery into a veritable paradise. 75. Suffering. Suffering is a gift from the gods in order to make men see the whole of life. 76. Infinity. A mathematician cannot, but a poet can enclose infinity in a line. 77. The poet and the world spirit. The world spirit conceals the various phases of her inner life in symbols. The universe is nothing but a great symbol, but she never takes the trouble to interpret these symbols for us. It is the duty of the poet to interpret these symbols for us. It is the duty of the poet to interpret them and to reveal their meaning to humanity. It would, therefore, appear that the poet and the world spirit are opposed to each other, since the former reveals what the latter conceals. 78. The vague and the obscure. Matthew Arnold is a very precise poet. I like, however, an element of obscurity and vagueness in poetry, since the vague and the obscure appear profound to the emotions. 79. The gramophone of history. History is a sort of huge gramophone in which the voices of nations are preserved. 80. Sin and piety. At least in one respect, sin is better than piety. There is an imaginative element in the former which is lacking in the latter. 81. Virtuous people. Sin has an educative value of its own. Virtuous people are very often stupid. 82. Contemplation without action. Life, like the arts of poetry and painting, is wholly expression. Contemplation without action is death. 83. Success in life. It is determination, not brains, that succeeds in life. 84. To become a public leader. If you wish to become a public leader, you ought to know how to flirt with the dame public, entertain her with platitudes, and, if necessary, with lies. 85. A successful man. Recognize your limitations, estimate your capacities, and your success in life is assured. 86. The lazy mind. There is something of the plant in the lazy mind. It cannot dance. 87. The moral value of suffering. No religious system can ignore the moral value of suffering. The error of the builders of Christianity was that they based their religion on the fact of suffering alone and ignored the moral value of other factors. Yet such a religious system was a necessity to the European mind in order to supplement the beautiful but one-sided Hellenic ideal. The Greek dream of life was certainly the best, as Goethe says, but it was wanting in the color element of suffering which was supplied by Christianity. 88. The big library. If you have got a big library and know all the books therein, it only shows that you are a rich man, not necessarily that you are a thinker. Your big library only means that your purse is heavy enough to hire many people to think for you. 89. Miracles. The question is not whether miracles did or did not happen. This is only a question of evidence which may be interpreted in various ways. The real question is whether belief in miracles is useful to a community. I say it is, since such a belief intensifies the sense of the supernatural which holds together primitive societies as well as those societies, e.g. Islam, whose nationality is ideal and not territorial. Looked at from the standpoint of social evolution, then, belief in miracles appears to be almost a necessity. 90. Democracy. Democracy has a tendency to foster the spirit of legality. This is not in itself bad, but unfortunately it tends to displace the purely moral standpoint and to make the illegal and the wrong identical in meaning. 91. Democracy and imperialism. The imperial ambitions of the various nations of Europe indicate that the Westerners are tired of democracy. The reaction against democracy in England and France is a very significant phenomenon. But in order to grasp the meaning of this phenomenon, the student of political sciences should not content himself merely with the investigation and discovery of the purely historical causes which have brought it about. He must go deeper and search the psychological causes of this reaction. 92. Moral readers. The ancients produced personalities. We produce moral readers. 93. The young prophets and the Muslim woman. Our young prophets of social reform think that a few doses of education on Western lines will revitalize the dead Muslim woman and make her tear her ancient shrouds. This is perhaps true, but I fear, finding herself naked, she will have once more to hide her body from the eyes of these young prophets. 94. Poets and politicians. Nations are born in the hearts of poets, they prosper and die in the hands of politicians. 95. A prophet. A prophet is only a practical poet. 96. Philosophy and poetry. Philosophy is a set of abstractions shivering in the cold night of human reason. The poet comes and warms them up into objectivity. 97. Plato and Goethe. Nature was not quite decided what to make of Plato, poet or philosopher. The same indecision she appears to have felt in the case of Goethe. 98. The most charming thing on earth. A woman of superb beauty with a complete absence of self-consciousness is to me the most charming thing on God's earth. 99. Conformity without dogma. The attitude of toleration and even conformity without belief in dogma is probably the most incomprehensible thing to the vulgar mind. If such is your attitude, keep quiet and never try to defend your position. 100. Sunset on the banks of Ravi. All the wonderful book lore in your library is not worth one glorious sunset on the banks of the Ravi. 101. True political life. True political life begins not with the claiming of rights, but with the doing of duties. 102. The importance of a true marriage. The beauties of nature can be realized only through the eyes of a lover, hence the importance of a true marriage. 103. God and the devil. Both God and the devil give man opportunities only, leaving him to make use of them in the way he thinks fit. 104. Think of the devil and he is sure to appear. This is equally true of God. 105. Thanksgiving. God, I thank thee for my birth in this world of rosy dawns, flame-clad sunsets and thick forests, wherein the gloom of nature's bygone nights rests in eternal sleep. 106. The psychologist and the poet. The psychologist swims, the poet dives. 107. The instinct to collect testimonials. In a certain class of Indian families, mostly creatures of the British rule, the tendency to collect and print testimonials from various officials has grown into a sort of instinct which reveals itself sometimes very early in the offspring. I look upon it as a kind of moral infirmity developed by an unhealthy environment. 108. The anatomy of the human mind. If you wish to study the anatomy of the human mind, you may go to Wundt, Ward, James, or Stout. But a real insight into human nature you can get from Goethe alone. 109. Man and infinity. As a plant growing on the bank of a stream heareth not the sweet silver music which sustains it from beneath, so man, growing on the brink of infinity, listeneth not to the divine undertone that maketh the life and harmony of his soul. 110. The poet. As a human being, come, dear friend, thou hast known me only as an abstract thinker and dreamer of high ideals. See me in my home playing with the children and giving them rides turn by turn as if I were a wooden horse. Ah, see me in the family circle lying in the feet of my grey-haired mother, the touch of whose rejuvenating hand bids the tide of time flow backward, and gives me once more the schoolboy feeling in spite of all the Kants and Hegels in my head. Here thou wilt know me as a human being. 111. The effect of philosophy and poetry. Philosophy ages, poetry rejuvenates. 112. Shakespeare and Goethe. Both Shakespeare and Goethe rethink the divine thought of creation. There is, however, one important difference between them. The realist Englishman rethinks the individual, the idealist German, the universal. His Faust is a seeming individual only. In reality, he is humanity individualized. 113. The value of the moment. I judge the worth of my days, months, and years from the experiences which they bring to me, and sometimes I'm surprised to find that a single moment is more valuable than a whole year. 114. Experience and knowledge. Every experience evokes something from the soul of man. Even the experience of sin will reveal some aspect of your soul of which you were not cognizant before. Experience, then, is a double source of knowledge. It gives you an insight into what is without you, as well as an insight into what is within you. 115. Commonplace facts. Nothing is more commonplace than facts. Yet mankind were blind to them until Bacon opened their eyes. 116. Horace, Montaigne, and Azad. So are we drawn, as wood is shoved, by others' sinews each way moved. Montaigne remarks on the above lines of Horace, we go not, but we are carried, as things that float, now gliding gently, now hulling violently, according as the water is either stormy or calm. While reading this passage in Montaigne, I was put in mind of a verse by our late and lamented poet Azad, who has given an expression to this idea much more beautifully than either Horace or Montaigne. He says, we ride the boat of the passing age, nay, not ride it but merely sitting on board without control. 117. Literary criticism. Literary criticism does not necessarily follow the creation of literature. We find Lessing at the very threshold of German literature. 118. Goethe and Heine. No nation was so fortunate as the Germans. They gave birth to Heine at the time when Goethe was singing in full-throated ease. 2 uninterrupted springs. 119. Hafiz, in words like cut jewels, Hafiz put the sweet, unconscious spirituality of the nightingale. 120. Love is a playful child. She makes our individuality and then quietly whispers in our ears, renounce it. 121. Seeking wisdom. I have often played hide and seek with wisdom. She conceals herself always behind the rock of determination. 122. The man with a single idea. If you wish to be heard in the noise of this world, let your soul be dominated by a single idea. It is the man with a single idea who creates political and social revolutions, establishes empires, and gives law to the world. 123. Art alone is boundless. Science, philosophy, religion all have limits. Art alone is boundless. 124. Absolute knowledge and moral growth. The result of all philosophical thought is that absolute knowledge is an impossibility. The poet Browning turns this impossibility to ethical use by a very ingenious argument. The uncertainty of human knowledge, teaches the poet, is a necessary condition of moral growth, since complete knowledge will destroy the liberty of human choice. 125. And flattery. Flattery is only exaggerated good manners. 126. The verse of Naziri. I would not exchange for half a dozen systems of philosophy this one verse of Naziri. Nothing falls short in my wasteland. Every wood that could not be my pulpit, I turned it into the gallows. 127. The weak and the strong. The weak lose themselves in God. The strong discover Him in themselves. 128. The question. For centuries, Eastern heart and intellect have been absorbed in the question, does God exist? I propose to raise a new question. New, that is to say for the East, does man exist? 129. Islam. Islam is not a religion in the ancient sense of the word. It is an attitude that is to say of freedom and even of defiance to the universe. It is really a protest against the entire outlook of the ancient world. Briefly, it is the discovery of man, 130, the Tawheed of Islam. Nietzsche thinks that belief in God makes man feeble. The wisdom of Islam consists in exploiting the idea of God in the interest of man, and transforming him into a source of power. For the Tawheed of Islam means absolute freedom from fear and superstition in actual life. A mere intellectual belief in God does not count for much in Islam. 131. Self-sacrifice. Before you talk of self-sacrifice, you must see whether you have got a self to sacrifice. The egotist alone is capable of self-sacrifice. 132. The rebirth of humanism. One of the most interesting phenomena of modern history is the birth, or rather the rebirth of humanism in the world of Islam. This will no doubt sharpen our sense for matter, which centuries of speculative Sufism had dulled. But we must not forget the distinction which the medieval thinkers of Europe made between use and enjoyment. We use all that is a means to the acquisition of the ultimate good. The eternal alone is enjoyable. All else is usable only. Europe forgot this distinction long ago, and there is no knowing where her unrestrained humanism will carry her. 133. Knowledge and fate. Knowledge partly contributes to the structure of what we call objective reality, but the character of events that drop out of the womb of fate is wholly determined by the heart of man. It is the weak man who endows fate with its sting. The strong man exploits his misfortunes inasmuch as he enhances the force of his soul by maintaining an attitude of total indifference to them. 134. The idea of mirage in Islam is face-to-face vision of reality without the slightest displacement of your own ego. It is impossible to forget the words of the Muslim poet who said of the Prophet this much: Moses fainted away by a mere surface illumination of reality. Thou seest the very substance of reality with a smile. 135. Human freedom. Most of our theologians thought the doctrine of human freedom could not be reconciled with the foreknowledge of God. They looked upon belief in freedom as veiled atheism. So thought Mahmud Shabistri. But the author of Gulshan-i-Raz made the tacit assumption of an absolute and independent time like Newton. He did not see that if his view of time were true, then the freedom of God would also disappear. Shabistri's argument will not hold today, for God can be conceived as creating time from moment to moment. If the universe is an open one, there is no pre-existing future, and God does not know the future because there is nothing to know. 136. The present. People extol the past and deprecate the present, not understanding that the present is the whole of the past, concentrated in one point.